Good afternoon. If you could all find a seat, please. Thank you all for coming on this beautiful autumn day. My name is Elliot Waldman, and I'm a first-year master's student in the International Development Program, and I also serve as coordinator for this year's Development Roundtable Speaker Series. On behalf of Dean Jessica Einhorn and the International Development Program, I want to warmly welcome you all to this special lecture with Dr. Robert Thompson. For those not too familiar with the Development Roundtable Speaker Series, some brief background. The Development Roundtable was originally conceived over a dozen years ago by our international development faculty, including former director Francis Fukuyama and our current directors Bill Douglas and Cinnamon Dornzeif. Roundtable events host experienced practitioners, academics, and government officials from all sectors of society and invite them to comment on one aspect of the challenges and promises of international development assistance. During the 2011 to 2012 academic year, the SAIS community will be examining the critical role of agriculture in international relations, a very underrepresented topic relative to its importance in shaping the lived experience of the world's 7 billion inhabitants. As part of that theme, we are extremely fortunate to have with us today one of the world's foremost authorities on international agriculture, Dr. Robert Thompson. To list for you all of his previous accomplishments would probably require a whole other lecture, but some brief highlights. After growing up on a small family farm in northern New York State, Dr. Thompson earned his PhD in agricultural economics from Purdue University, where he also taught and served as Dean of Agriculture. His previous leadership roles also include serving as Director of Agriculture and World Development at the World Bank, President and CEO of the Winrock International Institute for Agricultural Development, as Assistant Secretary for Economics at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and as Senior Staff Economist on the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Most recently, he held the Gardner Endowed Chair in Agricultural Policy at Purdue University, and he is currently a visiting scholar at SAIS with joint appointments to the International Development and Energy Resources and Environment Program. The title of his presentation today is The Challenge of Feeding 9 Billion by Mid-Century, but he has promised me that it won't be too depressing. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Robert Thompson.
Thanks very much, Elliot, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just delighted to see so many people turn out on such a beautiful day, and I'm also delighted to have been invited to spend a couple of years at SAIS as a visiting scholar. And I'm also extremely pleased that Dean Jessica Einhorn has declared this year as the Year of Agriculture. In many ways, it's appropriate that the Year of Agriculture follows the Year of Demography, which followed the Year of Water, because they're all so closely interrelated. And I think that this is that it's also appropriate that we put some emphasis on food and agriculture when you consider that the students at SAIS is preparing for international careers are certainly going to encounter a much higher prominence of food and agricultural issues in the 21st century than perhaps before. The widening gap between urban and rural residents in their incomes is creating political stresses in many countries that are accelerating the rural-urban migration, flooding cities with migrants faster than they have any hope of creating jobs. Also contributing to international migration as people seek higher earning opportunities. We've read about the food price spikes causing political chaos in some countries, bringing down several governments. Certainly the competition for two of the natural resources that are fundamental to agricultural production, land and water, are likely to cause cross-border conflicts. We also already see a lot of fallout from the so-called land grab as land-scarce countries in Asia seek land in other parts of the world on which they can produce agricultural commodities. And similarly, water-scarce countries in the Middle East and North Africa are also looking for land that's well-watered in other parts of the world. It's likely that a larger fraction of the world's food production will move through international markets, but yet global markets are severely distorted by agricultural policies, both domestic and international, in high and low-income countries, policies that often cause diplomatic stresses among normally friendly countries. And finally, of course, in a world of climate change, when all agro-ecosystems are going to be shifting, we're going to see some very significant dislocations, I believe, in world agriculture. So whether our students are preparing for diplomatic careers, careers in government service, private sector, NGOs, I think there's a high probability that many of them will see food and agriculture more prominently in their working lives than perhaps they anticipated. So if you had any doubts about why agriculture, why SAIS, why now, I hope my presentation this afternoon will disabuse you of any doubts you might have had in those regards. Okay, just to give you a sense of what we're going to try and cover today, we'll start out with a short discussion of food insecurity and hunger. We'll then turn to projections of global demand for food in the world. Then follow that with a discussion of the supply potential, particularly as it's complicated by global climate change. We'll talk a bit about national food security, the growing fraction of world agriculture production that's likely to move through international markets, and finally, what is going to be needed if we're to be successful at meeting the challenge of feeding 9 billion by mid-century. Actually, we recognize that the United Nations Population Office and other demographic think tanks raised for the first time in several decades their projected mid-century population. Really the appropriate title for my presentation, The Challenge of Feeding 9 billion by 2042 and 10 billion by the end of the century, because that's what they're now talking about. We'll look at food security from really three dimensions in the course of my presentation. The household level, the national level, and the global level. We'll look at the relationship between poverty and hunger, and point out that the rich in no country go hungry except in time of war or natural disaster or politically or militarily imposed famine. We'll look at the manner in which national food security that nothing will bring down a government faster than hungry people, so national food security is also an essential consideration. And then the ultimate question of global food security: can the world's farmers feed the larger population better than today at reasonable cost without destroying the environment? So, starting out with poverty and hunger, there are roughly 1 billion people who don't have enough purchasing power to access 1,800 calories per day. When FAO publishes its annual estimate in the fall of each year of the number of hungry in the world, that is their operational definition, that the number of people that they estimate that don't have sufficient purchasing power to access even 1,800 calories per day, which is not enough to put in a medium level of physical activity throughout the day, and certainly cuts into labor productivity. There's another billion people who suffer undernutrition, malnutrition, nutritional deficiencies such as vitamin A, iron, zinc, etc. So that's 2/7. 2 out of every 7 people on the planet that suffer some form of nutritional deficiency, whether it's caloric and micronutrients or just micronutrient deficiency. There's an estimated 2.4 billion people, that's almost 40% of the world's population, who are living on less than $2 a day. Now, by $2 a day, most people can afford enough calories, but by no stretch of the imagination, a nutritionally balanced diet. But because most of the people who go hungry in the world simply can't afford even enough calories, if we want to fix the world's hunger problem, we've got to solve the world's poverty problem. And there's one small complicating factor here. 70% of the extreme poverty in the world is in rural areas, and most of those people are farmers. And there has been a pronounced discrimination against rural areas in the allocation of international development assistance, as well as national budgets for development assistance in many of the low-income countries of the world. And the widening gap that's occurring between the urban haves and the rural have-nots in many of the low-income countries of the world are creating some significant political stresses. So we've got, on the one hand, the political stresses associated with price spikes or increasing price of food, and on the other hand, the widening income gap creating political stresses between urban and rural areas. Here's the distribution, according to the World Bank's most recent World Development Indicators, of where the extreme poverty is in the world. Point out that in sub-Saharan Africa, we have an estimated 556 million people on less than $2 a day, 388 on less than $1.25 a day. Now, these numbers are not as large as for South Asia, just above, or in the top line here, but the highest percentage of the population in the world in extreme poverty is found in sub-Saharan Africa. But these two regions, plus East Asia and the Pacific, have very significant numbers of people who can't or who don't have the purchasing power to consume an adequate diet. Now, the low-income population. Well, here's what happened in food prices over the last several years. It's a bit confusing diagram that FAO publishes, but across the scale we have January to December, and then the different colored lines represent the price behavior through those years. And we see that as we came into 2007, over here, this light blue line, we had almost a exponential increase in the price of food, and then when we pick up in 2008, where that left off, we get the spike about in the middle of the North American summer in 2008, then a significant drop as the world's farmers responded with more production. But then, as we came through 2009 and into 2010, we've got another rapid increase, and we hit an all-time record high in February this year and have continued at those relatively high levels. Now, when we recognize the fraction of the world's, or the fraction of their budgets that low-income consumers in developing countries spend on food, we see why the political crisis occurred in a number of countries. Just take, for example, these data that are published by the Asian Development Bank. In the income quintiles, these are groups of 20%, the 20% of income. So the first quintile in Bangladesh, this means that the poorest 20% of the population spend 69% of their income on food. But as we get down even to the richest 20% of the population of Bangladesh, they're still spending almost half of their income on food. Rice is the most important component of the diet in Bangladesh, and the price of rice tripled in a relatively short period of time in 2007 and 8. You see that even the wealthier members of society there were in trouble when the price of food skyrocketed to the extent it did. And in looking across these four Asian countries, even the lowest, that high-income group with the lowest fraction of their income spent on food was over a third, that being in Philippines. And we're talking about two-thirds, roughly, for the poorest members of these societies. So the point remains, then, that this price spike in 2007 and 8, and again this year, have pushed significant numbers of people back into the situation where they can't even afford a minimum caloric intake per day. And because of the increasing need for food aid as a result of the price spike, organizations like the World Food Program desperately needed to deliver more commodities to the poor in those countries. But of course, they operate on fixed budgets, and if the price of food doubled, that meant they could buy at most half of what they'd been buying before. So they too were in a crunch as a result of this. So we've got political stresses galore as a result of the high price of food in the world. But let's turn now to the longer term issue related to what's likely to happen to the demand for food in the world over the longer run. We know we've got a short-term problem. Over the longer term, the current projections of the population in the middle of the century have us reaching almost 9.6 billion people. We're right at 7 billion today. These numbers, as I said, were ratcheted up a bit this summer as the various demographic projections agencies discovered that fertility rates, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, were not coming down as fast as they had been assuming, and so they ratcheted up the projected population. But to put in perspective the challenge of how many more mouths that we're going to have to feed, remember the population of China today is 1.3 billion. So we're talking about the world's farmers being asked to feed the equivalent of 2 more Chinas between now and 2050 in the next 40 years. I think that puts in about as bold relief as I can the magnitude of the challenge. Now, when we look at where that population growth is occurring, over 2.5 billion of it is in low-income countries. And when you recognize that the U.S. Census Bureau projects that the U.S. population will grow by 120 million over the next 40 years, we see that the rest of the high-income world is actually projected to lose 30 million consumers in that period. Okay, where's the biggest population growth? Look at sub-Saharan Africa, the only region of the world that's projected to more than double its population, adding 134% more to its present population, about 883 million, bringing it up to over 2 billion. Sub-Saharan Africa is the biggest food aid recipient today. Many countries, chronic food aid recipients, and we're talking about very significant increase in the number of mouths to be fed. Remember, we also said that Sub-Saharan Africa is the region with the greatest concentration of extremely low-income consumers. The other big region is South Central Asia, projected increase 43%. It's 43% is a much slower rate of growth, but when you recognize that they already have 1.8 billion consumers, that still means that they're adding almost 800 million more mouths to be fed. So these are the two regions where we have the greatest challenge of needing to expand food production or food accessibility on the international market. Keep them in the back of your mind as we talk about where the supply potential in the world is. Just a couple of other comments concerning the demographic projections. It's important to keep in mind that where the population of China is slowing down, likely to peak out by about 2040 and actually begin declining as the cumulated effect of the one-child policy takes impact. But look at India, projected to have 350 million more consumers by the middle of the century than China. China gets lots of press about the impact that they've had on the global cereals economy, but I'm anticipating that India will have a bigger impact between now and 2050 than China has had to date on the world food economy. It's very difficult for me to come up with a scenario in which India has any possibility of being self-sufficient in food production, but we'll come back to that. Remember, we said Africa was the fastest growing region, and Nigeria jumps from 7th to 3rd place, passing the U.S. in population by the middle of the century. And we have Ethiopia and the Philippines knocking Russia and Japan off the top 10 largest population countries. But these largest population countries present some formidable challenges in terms of feeding them. Oops, I jumped one slide. Okay, population growth gets all the press, and I've emphasized it because it does present us a challenge. But we also have to keep in mind that we've had record rates of poverty reduction in low-income countries in recent years. And as incomes of the poor have risen, first, it's meant that more of them could escape from a status of going to bed hungry. But as the extremely poor receive larger incomes, most of the first increments of income gets spent on food. As we said before, by about $2 a day, most people can access enough calories. But where you get the most rapid growth in demand for agricultural commodities is incomes rise from about $2 to $10 a day. Because as increments to income spent on food decline over time, we have significant increases in consumption of meat, dairy products, fruits, vegetables, edible oils during this period. But once you get to about $10 a day, first, not much of the increments to income are being spent on food, and what is almost all being spent on value added to the raw product after it left the farm. More processing, more packaging, more convenience, eating out in restaurants more, trading up to luxury forms of the products, but not consuming more raw agriculture products. So we need to solve the poverty problem, to solve the hunger problem, and certainly on humanitarian grounds, we want to solve the hunger problem. But to the extent that we're successful, we unleash the period of most rapid growth in consumption of raw agricultural commodities as we move people up from $2 to about $10 per day. So it's very relevant when we're trying to project the demand for food in the world to also look at the magnitude of, or how many people in different parts of the world are in these income categories. And it surprises a lot of people, after all the hype about the rapid economic growth in China in recent decades, that according to World Bank estimates, 1 out of 6 Chinese are still living on less than $1.25 a day, and over a third on less than $2 a day. Most of the growth has been in the coastal provinces, and the urban interior, to a significant extent, has lagged behind. But look at India, with the numbers we talked about before, and with 41% of the population less than $1.25 a day, over 3/4 less than $2 a day. The point here is that with the Indian economy starting to move and economic growth accelerating, to the extent that they are successful in bringing down the incidence of poverty, the income effect is going to add a huge amount to their demand for food, just in addition to the population growth. So putting all this together, project that in the next 40 years, the world's demand for food will likely grow by 70 to 80%, with 40% increase in population, from 7 to 9.6 billion, almost all in low-income countries, and a likely and almost a comparable increase associated with successful broad-based economic growth. Now, this is the most difficult thing to project, but we do know that income growth rates are continuing at fairly rapid rates in many parts of the low-income world. There are at least 15 countries in sub-Saharan Africa with 6% growth rates. China and India haven't been as low as 6% in recent memory. So we are seeing broad-based economic growth continuing. It's often easy to forget about that when we in the United States and Europe are in the doldrums. But economic growth is continuing out there around the world. But the bottom line is that policies that accelerate broad-based economic growth, pro-poor economic growth in low-income countries, while they'll reduce hunger, they also unleash rapid growth in consumption of raw products. So, turning now to the global supply potential. The two most fundamental resources, of course, in agricultural supply are land and water. And there are a lot of estimates out there on how much more arable land can be brought into production. And as I've reviewed them, my conclusion is that there's at most 12% more arable land available worldwide that isn't presently forested or subject to erosion and desertification. And we know that there are soil losses and degradation of many soils occurring as cities are expanded, infrastructure is built, as farmers use up the nutrients in the soil and don't replenish them, as we have as we have erosion or desertification, et cetera, et cetera. So there may be 12% more land available that could be brought into production, but there are also forces working in the other direction, reducing land that's already in production. Now, FAO estimates, and a number of others, that we could double the number of hectares of land in farm production around the world. But a significant part of that land is forested, and if we wanted to double the number of hectares in production, we'd have to have massive destruction of forests, and in the process we'd lose wildlife habitat, biodiversity, reduce the carbon sequestration capacity of the planet, certainly unacceptable environmental outcomes. This leads me to the conclusion that the only environmentally sustainable alternative is to do something close to doubling the productivity on the fertile, non-erodible soils that are already in crop production. Because the alternative, after we get past about 10% increase, is it will simply have significant negative environmental consequences. But even that 10 to 12% additional land that may be available is in remote areas, mostly in South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, where there's little, if any, infrastructure, and in all cases, the soils are inferior in quality to those that are already in production, so the average productivity would be significantly lower. I like this map that was developed at the University of Wisconsin based on satellite imagery, and unfortunately it washes out when projected, but on the screen, on the TV screens on the sides, I think it's reasonably clear. But the interpretation of this map is that the darker the shading, the higher the percentage of the land under that pixel which is in crop production. So we see, for example, in the Corn Belt of the United States, it's extremely dark. Most of the available land is in production, extending up through the Wheat Belt into the Canadian prairies. Central and Eastern Europe is extremely dark. The Indo-Gangetic Plain is almost solid dark shading. China is quite dark. Meaning high percentages of the potentially arable land in these regions is already in crop production. But look here in the southern hemisphere, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, in the savanna regions, not the rainforest, but in the savanna regions of these two continents. This is where most of that 10 to 12% additional land that might be brought into production resides. Now, to illustrate the quality issue, the quality of soil issue that I mentioned before, this is a map of inherent land quality developed by the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, and it has two criteria by which it categorizes all the soils of the planet. One is soil performance, basically fertility, and the other is resilience or resistance to erosion. The green color, these are the best soils on both criteria. But when you look around the entire world, you see that there are really only 3 spots where there's any significant concentration of these best soils. You've got the Corn Belt of the United States extending on down the Mississippi. You've got the Black Soils region north of the Black Sea, here Ukraine and neighboring countries. And you've got the Pampa of Argentina, and that's pretty much it. There's a little bit in California. There are little tiny spots elsewhere. But the good soils are basically all in production already. Now, the area of most recent significant expansion is in the savanna region of Brazil, right in this area, whereas the soybean expansion has occurred in recent years. We lived in Brazil for 2 years in 1972 and 73. And back then, when you drove out through that area, it was an area you could never imagine in agricultural production. It was twisted, gnarled trees and bushes, an occasional scrawny beef cow, and you simply couldn't imagine it in crop production. Today, you drive out through that same area, it's soybeans from horizon to horizon, and with comparable productivity to that in, say, Illinois and Iowa, in the best of our agricultural lands in this country. And that's on these soils which are medium in the 2 criteria, or low performance but high resiliency, the red areas, in this region. So basically it says that you can make these soils productive, but it takes a lot of research to figure out how to manage them. It may take research in crop genetics to match the soil, or to match the genetic potential of the plant with the local agroecological conditions. Despite having higher cost of production, they've demonstrated that you can make it work. And there is more of that land in Brazil that's without invading rainforest in the savanna region. But there's one Brazil, quote unquote, left in the world cereals economy. And basically you take the same latitudes where the soybean expansion occurred in Brazil and pull it straight east in sub-Saharan Africa. This is the savanna zone of Zambia, Zimbabwe, down to Mozambique, across to Angola. It has similar potential, similar problems, but also in a technical sense, similar potential to that land in Brazil. Now, you've got governance problems, you've got lack of property rights, you've got underinvestment in infrastructure, you may have the rule of law. It may not be very well adhered to, contracts impossible to enforce, underinvestment in research, rural education, rural health care. But despite that long list of ifs, in a technical sense, this could be, we could have a very significant expansion here, just as we did in Brazil in recent decades. I put that long list of ifs up there, though, to illustrate that, yes, technically it's possible, but in terms of the likelihood of happening anytime soon, it's probably not terribly likely. Now, there is at least somebody else in the world that believes in the agricultural potential of this area, because this, of course, is the area of the so-called land grabs of East Asian countries coming in, trying to buy up large tracts of land. They at least believe in the long-term productive potential of that area. Also, water-scarce countries of North Africa and the Middle East have been looking for land. But there was an article in the Times of India just before Thanksgiving last year, which really surprised me. The article was about Punjabi farmers from northwestern India buying land in South America. So it's not just going into Africa, it's also into this area of South America where there's still some potential expansion. So I dwell on this to make the point that there just isn't very much more land available to be brought into production, and what there is going to have a bunch of challenges associated with it. But land may not even be the most binding constraint that we're confronting. You know, with the rate of urbanization going on, a couple of years ago, for the first time in the history of humanity, more than half of the world's population lived in cities. That's projected to grow to 60% by 2030, to 70% by 2050. Now, farmers are estimated to use 70% of the fresh water used in the world today. And I'll tell you, if 70% of the world's population is living in cities, the world's farmers will not have access to 70% of the fresh water. Cities will outbid farmers for available water, and we're seeing that happen. There have even been cases in California where Southern California cities went up and bought farms in the Central Valley, stripped off the water rights, shipped the water south, and let the farm go back to desert. And I think we'll see more of that in other parts of the world. So one of the problems is that water is priced at zero to most of the world's farmers. And in fact, in India, it's worse than that. Not only do farmers not pay anything for water, they don't pay anything for the electricity to pump it out of the ground with. And so you've got no incentive to use the water efficiently. And in fact, in the Indo-Gangetic Plain of India, you're pulling down the aquifer at a faster rate than it's recharging. And we've talked about that being the place in the world that's probably got the greatest, or the one country in the world with the greatest growth in demand for food, and yet water is becoming an increasingly binding constraint and will probably not allow even present productivity levels to be sustained in that part of the world. Now, I don't underestimate the political difficulty of starting to charge farmers in a positive price for water in a part of the world where there's never been a tradition of paying for it. But we're going to have to do something to induce more efficient use of the water, because you simply, no water, no agricultural output, no food production. There's lots better technology available to increase the efficiency of water use if farmers had the incentive to use it. Now I want to turn to climate. This map, developed by the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis just outside Vienna, in a highly aggregative sense, illustrates the climatic constraints to agricultural production in the world today. The green areas are basically no climatic constraints. So the areas where the soybean expansion occurred in Brazil, where we've talked about its potential here, it's fully consistent. Of course, the blue areas, this is a cold temperature constraint limiting how far north you can push annual cropping. The dark brown are the deserts of the world. The yellow areas are the semi-arid regions, mostly on the boundaries of deserts. But with global climate change, the one the one thing that virtually everybody agrees on in the long-term projections is that the average temperature will increase more over land than over water, and more at the poles, the North and South Pole, than at the equator. Now, most of what you'll read talks about the increase in average temperature that will happen in the planet as a result of global warming. But we really got to get beyond that, because we're talking about, again, more, 3/4 of the world's surface is water. We're talking about more temperature increase over land than over water, and more at the poles. So this margin imposed on how far north you can produce is going to shift. There's no question about that, as at least the temperature constraint will not be keeping agricultural production as far south as it is today. So this means that Canada, maybe Alaska, Siberia, ought to, or at least should have the potential in terms of not being constrained by cold climate, to play a bigger role in the international production. Now, once you've got the temperature conditions, then you've got to worry about rainfall, and we'll turn to that in a second. So the projections on rainfall, though, are very much more tenuous than the temperature projections. And in fact, there's great disagreement in the various global circulation models in what they expect to happen with the level and the distribution of precipitation. But some of the things that there seems to be the most consensus on is there'll be the largest reduction in the subtropics, especially on the poleward edges. So if we go back and look at this means these yellow areas in the margins of deserts are likely to be expanded somewhat. The largest increases in precipitation would occur in the higher latitudes. So the Canadian prairies have very good soils, but are severely restricted in how much they can produce by low rainfall. So we could very easily see the Canadian prairies become much more productive. And there also is some sense that there may be an increase under the monsoons. On the one hand, this may be positive, but it may be in excess. But I think the agronomic scientists are beginning to feel that the increased frequency of extreme climatic events may well be the greatest impact on agriculture of climate change. Not the increasing average temperature, not the effect on rainfall, as much as the increasing frequency of extreme droughts, extreme flooding, extreme blizzards, extreme tornadic activity, extreme hurricanes, and we've been seeing more and more of that in recent years. So there's no question but what adaptations are going to be required as a result of global climate change, or global warming, including global warming, that all agroecosystems are going to be shifting. And that means that we're going to need to do more research to adaptive plant breeding just to sustain present productivity levels in virtually all the agroecosystems of the world. If we have greater variability in climatic conditions, it may put a high premium on increasing more drought tolerance, more heat tolerance into the varieties we're producing. Some regions will probably have to change the mix of what crops they produce, but it also means that there's a high probability that we'll see a larger fraction of the world's food production move through international markets as some regions of the world lose capacity to produce food while others expand their capacity. So putting all of this together, we need a significant increase in the food system productivity. There are a number of places we can work on that. We might be able to make presently unusable soils productive. There are a lot of soils on the planet that have high sodium chloride content and high salt content that precludes agriculture production. There's certainly potential increased genetic potential of various livestock and plant species. But once we have that genetic potential in plants or animals, we need to improve their nutrition, be sure we're feeding them optimally, increase the water availability and control in plants, reduce competition from weeds for water, nutrients, sunlight, reduce losses from disease and insects, and we need to reduce post-harvest losses. Many low-income countries, it's estimated that at least 25%, if not 40%, of what's produced gets lost between the farmer's field and the urban consumer. It may be rats, it may be rotting, it may be insect losses, it may be bags of grain dribbling out as trucks rumble down the miserable roads in rural parts of the developing world. But certainly this is an area we've got to work on, as well as all of the others Now I want to just to illustrate a little bit of the potential for productivity growth, to suggest that it may not be as bleak as it might sound. This is another map that was developed up at that same laboratory at the University of Wisconsin. And I looked for years to find a map to illustrate this, and finally did it. So it's really great analysis that they did. But basically what we have is you go up the color spectrum from deep blue to red. You're going from the lowest to the highest yield per hectare of land or per acre of land in cereal grains production. For reference, the average yield of wheat and rice are in this green area. The average yield worldwide of corn production is just getting up into the yellow area here. So you're basically in this color range is the world average. So when we're talking about down in the dark blue, we're talking to maybe a third to a half of the world average. When you get up into the orange and reds, you're talking about a multiple of the world average productivity. But let's look first just at the high productivity areas of the world. Well, you look for orange spots, and you basically only find three. The biggest one is in the U.S. Corn Belt. Probably the next biggest is up in Heilongjiang province in northeastern China, a little bit also in central China. And then some orange up here in the low countries, up into Denmark and the Netherlands and so on, and that's it. Now you get back down into the yellow range, which is about twice the world average productivity in rice and wheat, and a little less than the average in corn, or a little more than the average in corn. You get most of the rest of China. You get quite a bit more of Western Europe, except for Iberia and Italy. You get a bigger area in the U.S. You get little spots in South America. But when you get down into the green area, which is about the world average productivity, you can bring in a lot more of Argentina, southern Brazil, bigger areas in North America. You pull in Iberia and Italy and Central Europe. You get a good deal of Southeast Asia, southeastern Australia. But then in the blue areas, you basically pick up all of sub-Saharan Africa, a significant part of India, and out here in what I call the stands of the former Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc., and also up here in the Canadian prairies. Now remember what I said a few minutes ago about the Canadian prairies. You basically got comparably good soil to that in the U.S. Corn Belt, but up there you simply don't have the precipitation to make that to take advantage of the inherent fertility of the soil. So that's one of the reasons that this region could become a much greater breadbasket for the world than it is today. Now out here's another area. These deep black fertile soils of Ukraine and in neighboring areas, comparably good soils extend on out here into the stands as well. Now the difference here though is that the long-term climate models suggest that this area is probably going to get more precipitation and this area less. So you have to look at the climatic conditions as well as the soils conditions, but to evaluate the potential. But when we see the incredible differences that exist in productivity across the planet, there has to be some very significant possibilities, particularly in the savanna region of sub-Saharan Africa, to significantly increase agriculture production. I think I can skip over that. Now, one of the issues, of course, when we're looking at differences in yields across the world, is to what extent is the inherent fertility of the soil able to provide the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that the crops need to grow, and if it isn't available in the soil, to what extent is the farmer supplying it through applications of fertilizer, organic and or inorganic fertilizer. Now, this set of bar charts, we've got pairs of bar charts for different regions of the world, And the interpretation is that the left-hand bar is for the beginning of the 1960s. The right-hand bar of each pair is at the turn of the century, around 2000. And we start with East Asia, didn't put very much fertilizer on in the 60s. The highest application rates of fertilizer in the world today, which suggests that, which is consistent with what we saw in the yield chart, that you are pushing those crops pretty hard. This pair of bars is the industrialized countries. Interesting how much less fertilizer application per acre is going on in the industrial countries than, say, East Asia. Here's South Asia, starting very low in the 60s and jumping almost as high as the industrial countries, mainly India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And then we come all the way down here to sub-Saharan Africa with virtually nothing in the 1960s and very, very little fertilizer use at the turn of the century. And so fully consistent with the reality that we saw before of how low the yields are in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a very infertile soil, one that just doesn't have much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in it. And so anything you're going to grow on that soil, you've pretty well got to supply the nutrients artificially, either through organic or inorganic fertilization. So in addition to these biological and physical explanations of the differences in yields we observe, we also have to remember that we've got to have markets to supply farmers with seeds, fertilizer, pest control strategies, credit, and so on, and also markets to buy their products. If we're going to have those markets evolve, we need a business-friendly investment climate. We need remunerative input and output prices, and this in many cases reflects the inadequate investments that have been made in rural transportation and communications infrastructure. For example, I spent a weekend out near Lake Victoria several years ago, and we were talking to farmers who were growing traditional variety of maize or corn that grew 1 ton per hectare. We knew there were hybrid varieties in that area that could produce 4 tons per hectare, and we said, we wanted to figure out, well, what's going on here? Why aren't they using the improved technologies that are available? By the time we get done converting Kenyan shillings per kilo to dollars per metric ton, we found that those farmers were paying 500% of the world market price for fertilizer, 5 times. And high cost of transportation. And of course, any of you who have traveled much in low-income countries know that frequently you come up to a boom across the road, and there's either a policeman or a soldier at the end of the boom, and if you want the boom raised to pass on by, you probably have to grease their palm a little bit. Well, the combination of the extremely high transport costs associated with the miserable state of rural roads and the graft and corruption that exist, fertilizer was so expensive it didn't pay to adopt the improved varieties, the benefit of which you didn't get if you didn't use some fertilizer. Similarly, the high transport cost reduces the farm gate price of the product they're producing, so you've got low price of the product, high price of the inputs, and the economics simply didn't work. The new technologies just sat there on the shelf, not adopted. So I actually, when I left the World Bank, had concluded that probably the greatest detriment to agricultural development in sub-Saharan Africa was the underinvestment in rural infrastructure, the miserable state of rural roads and the high associated cost of transport. Fortunately, the deficit in communications infrastructure is being rapidly overcome with the building of cell phone towers in most villages having somebody at least that has a cell phone. And of course, the knowledge and skills of farmers is a relevant factor. Do they know? Are they familiar with the technologies necessary to get higher productivity? So a number of factors. They're both biological, chemical, physical, as well as social. But putting all of this together, we're certainly going to have more investments in agriculture research to sustain present productivity levels in the face of global climate change, as well as to increase the average productivity by something close to doubling the average productivity of the soil. And remember, if we're going to have to produce close to twice as much output using less water than today, we may be talking about asking farmers to triple the crop per drop, or the average productivity of the water that they're using. So So research is going to be needed, but we've pretty well exhausted the potential of the so-called green revolution technologies of the 60s and 70s. We do have biotechnology that opens up new frontiers, that gives us the potential to improve the nutritional content of grains, that gives us the means to increase tolerance of drought, wetness, temperature, and so on, internalize resistance to diseases, reduce pesticide use, slow down product deterioration. But there are some significant debates in parts of the world about biotechnology, but it does have the potential to increase the efficiency of research, the efficiency with which we make genetic progress, and also sometimes a trait that we need does not reside in the variety or in the species that we're dealing with. For example, corn is not particularly drought tolerant. Sorghum is. But they have different numbers of chromosomes, so you can't cross them. But sorghum has greater drought tolerance because it has a waxy coat on the outside. Now, if you can go over and snip out the gene that codes for that waxy coat in sorghum and splice it into corn and get it expressed, you increase the drought tolerance of the corn plant that you're producing, and in a manner in which would not be possible through traditional plant breeding techniques. So the potential's there as long as scientists are allowed to make use of the research techniques. Now, just a few comments about national food security before we bring this to wrap up. I think it is important to remember that from an individual country's perspective, food is a strategic product, that it's essential for the country to maintain its economic, political, and or military power. But people have got to have access to a reliable, safe and nutritious, reasonably priced supply of food from some combination of domestic production as well as imports. And we know that in general it would be economically inefficient and environmentally unsustainable to try to be self-sufficient in everything. But the fact remains that most of the low-income countries of the world's agricultures are significantly underperforming relative to the potential that would be both economically efficient and environmentally sustainable. Point is, we simply have not made the investments in agricultural development, ag research, rural infrastructure, and so on that would be necessary to take advantage of the productive potential that resides in those countries. Now, I mentioned that in discussing the global climate change, that we're likely to see a larger fraction of world food production move through international markets because of the shifting of agroecosystems. But there's another reason, which brings us back where we started our discussion of the land constraint. On these two pie charts, we have the percentage distribution of population around the world by region on the right, and we have the percentage distribution of arable land over here on the left chart. I'd like to draw your attention to the dark red wedge on the right and the pink wedge on the left. Dark red is East Asia, pink is South Asia, and these two regions together have roughly twice the fraction of the world's population than they do of the arable land. And then if you think back that East Asia had by far and away the heaviest fertilizer application rates in the world, with some relatively high crop yields, there's certainly no way that East Asia can possibly be self-sufficient in food production. When we consider the speed at which South Asia's population is growing, that this 15% of the population over here is going to be significantly larger. So the difference between the fraction of, populations over here, the difference between the fraction of the population and of the arable land is going to widen even more so. And again, with population growth, urbanization, economic growth, I just can't see any scenario in which East and South Asia can possibly be self-sufficient. Similarly, Middle East and North Africa, but of course there it's the shortage of water, not the shortage of land relative to population. But I've said several times that we need larger investments in agriculture development, rural development in general, if we're going to be successful in raising productivity to helping the low-income countries achieve more of the agriculture production potential. But sadly, since the mid-1980s, agriculture has been off the world development agenda. Up until the 1980s, I think most people recognized the fundamental importance of food production, also the fact that the majority of the poor were in rural areas. And so it was recognized that if we're going to successfully reduce poverty, reduce hunger, we've got to invest significantly more in agricultural development and rural development. But in the U.S. case, for example, in the 1980s, 25% of our foreign aid went to agriculture development. This had dropped to 6% by 1990, and it was down to 1%. Actually, it should be 2 years ago now. We had a slight increase with the Feed the Future initiative of the President that Congress ratified, but it's probably the most vulnerable part of the foreign aid budget right now as we look to budget cuts. Lending by the World Bank dropped precipitously for agriculture development, and as foreign aid and World Bank allocations for agriculture and rural development dropped, national investments in low-income countries fell as well. So agriculture and rural development basically stagnated. And another of the reasons that we saw those huge differences in yields across between low-income regions like sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. So, but in fairness, we also need to recognize the developing countries themselves have not been particularly kind to their agriculture and rural development. In part, corruption, macroeconomic instability, failure to define or enforce property rights. And this is a particular problem in sub-Saharan Africa. Women grow 70% of the food produced in sub-Saharan Africa, but yet in many countries a woman can't get clear title to farm land. So if they can't get title to farm land, they're not going to make the same investment in maintaining the quality of the soil that they would if they had the property rights. And then we've talked about the underinvestment in rural roads and research. But the balance of political power also in low-income countries has tended to favor people who resided in the cities over rural areas. It's the great paradox of agricultural policy that in high-income countries, with farmers representing perhaps less than 2% of the population, they've been able to extract billions of dollars of income transfers from lower-income taxpayers. But in low-income countries, where 70% of the extreme poverty resides in rural areas, the terms of trade in many cases have actually been turned against farmers. Net taxation, not net subsidization. Now, this has changed over time in the last decade or two in all parts of the world but sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, there's still government policy makes farmers pay more for their inputs and receive less than the world market price for their product. And so you've got an economic disincentive to performance there, and basically keeping the income earning potential of the already lowest income members of global society artificially depressed. So to wrap it up, next to the last slide, because the world's arable land isn't distributed around the world in the same proportions as population, this is going to contribute to more of the world's food production moving through trade. Because agriculture in low-income countries has been underperforming relative to its potential, there is great upside hope there, especially where the disincentives have been reduced. But the fact remains that with population and income growth in many low-income countries, even if we improve their agriculture production, the demand for food may or is likely to outstrip their food production potential. And this too will contribute to more food moving through international trade. But we really need to have a successful Doha development round. This round of WTO trade negotiations is supposed to be opening up opportunities for low-income countries. We can't expect them to rely more on the world market for part of their food security if they can't export products in which they have a comparative advantage. And unfortunately, we in the high-income world are most protectionist in some of the very products in which the low-income countries have the greatest comparative advantage. Things like labor-intensive manufacturers, footwear and textiles, agricultural commodities that do well in the humid tropics like sugar, like cotton and rice. So, to wrap it up, what are the long-term prospects? Well, since the time of Malthus, we've had lots of prophets of doom. who've argued that population growth will outstrip food production capacity and that starvation would eventually limit the world's population. But what Malthus did not anticipate is that investments by both the public and the private sector in agriculture research actually increase productivity faster than demand has grown. And up until 2008, we actually had a slight negative trend to the real price of grains in the world after taking out the effect of inflation. Now the big question is, post-2008, after the big price spike, are we going to see prices stabilize at a higher plateau, resume their long-term downward trend, or increase over time? And basically, my conclusion is that this will depend, once again, on whether we invest enough in agriculture research to raise productivity fast enough to not only satisfy the growing demand for food in the world, but also the reality that we're probably going to continue to use some agricultural production as raw materials from which to produce biofuels. So, I'm a technology optimist. If we invest enough in research in the public and private sector, I'm confident that while prices may stabilize at a higher level, that they don't necessarily need to rise that rapidly. Unfortunately, with the low investments we're making in agriculture development, and even less in agriculture research, this is not looked very likely, at least in the near term. The conclusion from which would lead us to believe that there's a high probability that not only will we have higher food prices, but that the trend will be upward over time, reversing the 150-year downward trend. But with that, let me just wrap it up and indicate that I think one of the most important things we need to be trying to avoid in this budget climate in Washington is further reduction in foreign aid, particularly that which is going to agriculture development, because there aren't many issues that are going to have the potential to be more damaging in the world than this over the next few years. So with that, let me stop, and are there a few questions? You want to field the questions?
Yeah, we can move over here.
Okay.
Please just introduce yourself, give a brief background, and keep your questions to one per person, please, as we're a little bit limited on time and we'd like to get as many questions as possible. So, yes, right over here in the middle.
Curtis Weller, USAID. Question relates to, you made the comment about taking genetic material from sorghum and putting it in corn or maize. And I was curious, have you heard any debates one way or another relative to in the economic sense of that? Might it be better to, rather than invest in taking genetic material out of sorghum and putting it in maize, to maybe just try and spend that money trying to raise the yield levels for sorghum? Since in sub-Saharan Africa, it is basically an indigenous crop, and trying to raise that and any other agronomic factors that might be related.
Absolutely, great potential to increase productivity in sorghum, and I don't argue that genetic engineering is the silver bullet that's going to solve all our problems. Simply that it increases the efficiency of genetic progress, and it gives you the potential, if there's a trait in a different species that would benefit a different species or your target species, then it's we need all the tools available. But it's just as likely that it would go the other way, and sorghum would benefit from transfer as well.
I think there was another question over here. The ma'am in the gray shirt.
Hi, my name's Anne. I'm a second-year student here at SAIS. And I was wondering about land grabs. You mentioned that it's an increasing trend of like Middle Eastern and Asian countries going to Africa or Latin America. And do you feel that's a positive development in the way of they have newer technologies, they might invest in infrastructure, and in the long run that will actually increase the benefits? Or do you think it's negative in the way if they're taking land away from farmers that don't have property rights and that will just go jobless?
Yeah, this is the great challenge. We know that there's gross underinvestment in agriculture development and in rural infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa. When I travel in that region, I run into Chinese everywhere, building roads. Now, many of the roads go from mines to ports, but roads from mines to ports pass a lot of farmland along the way. But there's no question but what they're the biggest investors right now in rural development, agriculture development, but there's also the issue about buying up land. I think there definitely needs to be a code of good conduct, and the World Bank and FAO are both working on that. The challenge is to take advantage of the opportunity to bring in that foreign capital to supplement what's available locally, because they aren't going to get the job done with the local resources, but yet do it in a manner where the farmers who are already there benefit as well. But it's a very good question and in a very delicate political issue right now.
Yes, sir.
With regard to genetically engineered crops.
I'm sorry, could you please introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Peter Davies, State Department. With regard to genetically engineered crops, there's certainly a lot of potential there, but the problem is government decisions not to adopt these crops under the influence of groups of what in this audience I will call wacko NGOs. So it seems to me that the important point is to somehow counter the arguments of these NGOs. Mm-hmm. Science doesn't seem to work. In other words, scientific arguments, they do not take any notice of these. Do you have any suggestion on what might be done to alter the attitude of governments to the adoption of genetically engineered crops?
Well, the biggest problems are in sub-Saharan Africa. Globally, the big three, China, India, Brazil, the big three in terms of agricultural research in the public sector, they basically embraced biotechnology. The trains left the station, and the European NGOs in sub-Saharan Africa are not on the train. The government of China is investing $3 billion in agricultural biotechnology right now. Biggest commitment any country in the world. But India and Brazil are also using the research techniques. Now, I think, as I said before, I don't think it's a silver bullet, but I think it would be when all the academies of science that have looked at it. In France, both the Academy of Medicine as well as the Academy of Science have said there's no evidence of either human health or environmental problems with genetic engineering. That you're right that emotion has trumped science in public attitudes, but probably with the likely impacts of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa, that's the one region that has the most potential to benefit, and probably the greatest tragedy of what the European NGOs have done in poisoning the well about using the research technique. Yes. You on this side too.
Yeah.
Thank you, David Lambert. The World Food Prize laureates this year are the former presidents of Brazil and Ghana. Could you say something about their experiences and what models they might serve for the rest of the developing world in agricultural production and food security?
Mm-hmm. President Lula has probably had a greater positive impact on poverty reduction and hunger reduction through some of the programs that he's implemented in terms of social welfare programs, of much as Mexico has done of requiring certain behaviors such as keeping the kids in school and getting them immunized and so on in exchange for social welfare. But there's also been a big improvement in rural education, public education that in rural areas. But this is the second time that Brazil has been honored with the World Food Prize, and probably the greatest positive impact was the research commitment they made in Embrapa, the Brazilian National Agriculture Research Corporation, and their tropical soils research together with classical soybean breeding is really what made it possible to bring that entire savanna region, or the so-called Cerrado region, into this extremely highly productive state that it's in today. So I think that the commitment to rural development, both in agriculture research, rural education, improving the infrastructure, that's the most important role of government in development, is to provide those rural public goods. And then create a business-friendly investment climate so the private sector will invest in the seed companies and the fertilizer companies and so on, and the marketing infrastructure to take the product from the farm to the consumer, to the port. So Brazil, I think, is one of the great positive examples. Personally, I don't have quite as much detailed information about Ghana, but they've been within sub-Saharan Africa, they're certainly doing better than most other countries because they have increased the investment in agriculture and rural development rather than letting it stagnate as it used to. Yeah, somebody else.
In the back, ma'am. You can wait for the microphone to arrive. Thank you.
My name is Alex. I'm a first-year student with George Washington University. My question was about I was wondering, what is the reason for the reduction in investment in agricultural development since the 80s, as you mentioned?
Okay, there are several reasons, or several factors that played into it. In the mid-'80s, the United States and the European Union were in a game of competitive export subsidization. We both had crop surpluses, and we were driving down the world market price with our agricultural subsidies. And as a result, grain was available pretty cheap on the world market, so it was more difficult to get a good benefit-cost ratio in an agriculture development project. That was one factor. Second, agricultural projects are generally riskier. Farming is a risky business. Prices are not under the farmer's control, and crop yields are under the control of the weather. And so you do have a lot of risk in the business. And people working in development, I think, just found a lot of frustration in agriculture development or managing agriculture development projects. But furthermore, the European NGOs in particular were arguing that modern agricultural science was part of the problem, not part of the solution, and this too pushed foreign aid programs away from investing in agriculture. And then there was a whole agenda of hot new issues coming on. There was the environment, there was HIV/AIDS, gender, privatization, democratization, all important areas, but in many cases foreign aid budgets were shrinking when you had this broader set of hot issues. And agriculture, I guess, was viewed as sort of old and boring, and besides, the U.S. and EU were making food aid available at very cheap terms, so it got the governments of those countries off the hook to do something about their agriculture. But as a result, agriculture there is stagnated, and today we need their productive capacity. There's a question down here.
Hi, I'm Jeff Baranek from National Ag Statistics, USDA. My question is, the goal, as I understand it, as you've outlined it, is to increase the total number of calories available internationally. Given the number of constraints you've outlined, particularly the one on the amount of arable land that is available or could be available, I'm wondering what part you see in this model of an ag activity like aquaculture playing. I mean, after all, aquaculture doesn't really require arable land, or if it's done offshore, really any land at all.
Yeah. Well, if I came across sounding like calories is the only thing that mattered, I'm sorry. No, clearly you got to have enough energy to put in a day's physical activity, or for kids to put in a day studying in school. But nutritional deficiency diseases are rampant in low-income countries, and in some cases they kill a lot more people than than some of the diseases caused by pathogens that get a lot more investment. So I want to argue that we need not only calories but amino acids and all the vitamins and minerals. That said, now lost the train of thought on your
aquaculture.
Aquaculture. Yeah, absolutely. No, the fish are the most efficient converters of feed into meat. You get just about 1 pound of meat per pound of feed. So aquaculture has a great potential role to play in the protein production across the world. So I'm definitely believe in aquaculture. Poultry also is almost as efficient as fish. Then your pork is much less efficient and cattle even less. But I believe that governments will allow consumer sovereignty to prevail, but to the extent that if people want to eat meat, they'll be allowed to. But we can get a lot more protein production if we use a lot more fish and poultry than pigs and beef cattle.
Okay. We have time for just about one more question. Is there a student who would like to ask a question? No? Okay. Yes, gentleman in the back there.
Hi, my name is Ryan Tang. I'm a second-year student here at SAIS. I read a book, actually it was several years ago, so I don't know the current data, but its assertion was that there is enough food in the world currently to feed all of the people. It's just really a question of people having the money to pay for it and, of course, distribution. So my question is, if everybody has maybe that $10 per day that you were mentioning, or is there enough food in the world to supply everybody a nutritionally sufficient amount of food today, the 7 billion people today, or even in the future as population grows?
No. The reason there's enough food available in the world today is because you have a couple billion people that don't have the purchasing power, or a billion doesn't have the purchasing power to access even 1,800 calories per day, and then another billion that can't afford a balanced diet. So if we had solved the poverty problem today, we'd have much higher priced food in the world, because it would simply be there simply wouldn't be enough to go around to satisfy everybody. So that's one of the reasons that I put so much emphasis on population growth. Gets all the press, but don't forget income growth, because as we have population growth and successful broad-based economic growth, the income effect has the potential to add as much to demand as population growth, and therefore we're glad that we solved the hunger problem, but we unleash the most rapid rate of growth in demand for food and overall when we do it.
Thank you. Okay, please join me in thanking Professor Thompson again. Thank you very much for coming. If you would like to be informed of future development roundtable events, there's a sign-up sheet over there, as well as our final schedule.
Other questions come on up.
Okay. And other questions can please come on up here and ask Professor Thompson directly. Thank you, and have a wonderful weekend.